Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and this is about why boarding school novels are the best. In this video I'll make my case for the genre. I'll talk about the common tropes and cliches in the traditional boarding school novels, how modern interpretations turn these on its head, and recommend some of my favourites from across the board. Now, I'm by no means an expert on the boarding school novel, and I know there are many great novels that I haven't yet read. So please leave your recommendations in the comments down below. I, like most Germans, like most people in the world probably, have never even set foot inside a boarding school, ever. And yet I've always loved books that were set in those places, especially in girls' schools. The very first set of boarding school novels that I really remember loving as a child were Enid Blyton's St. Clare series. This series of books was so popular in Germany and I loved all of them. Only as an adult I actually managed to get hold of the original English novels, courtesy of my mother-in-law. These books were written in the early 1940s and they're all set in the fictional girls' school of St. Clare's. The main protagonists in the early books are twins Patricia and Isabel, two headstrong sisters from a privileged family who are sent to boarding school for the very first time. School at St. Clare's involves a lot of French lessons, midnight parties and lacrosse, a game that I genuinely thought was made up for most of my life. The twins get to St. Clare's and hate everything there, from the schoolwork to the teachers to the other girls. But by the end of the book, they are well-adapted, polite ladies who love their school, feel loyal towards it, and love the work that they do there. This setup brings me neatly to the first trope I want to discuss. I will call it the reformation of the rebel girl. In St. Clare's, as well as other traditional early 20th century boarding school stories, the school is often described as this transformational place where previously bad girls learn to behave like ladies. This usually involves a combination of learning manners, obedience and needlework. The rebel girl, who's often characterized by a dislike of girly things like cross-stitch and sitting still, slowly sees the error of her ways and learns the value of hard work and of following the rules. This change is usually brought about by at least one very patient friend who withstands the rebel girl's temper tantrums, and there's also usually at least one good-natured teacher involved who sees the talent and the potential behind the stroppy attitude. This trope is actually the main plot point of another childhood favourite of mine, which is a German boarding school novel titled Der Trotzkopf by Emmy von Rhoden. The title of this book is a German term used to describe a very stubborn person. This is a children's classic from 1885 and it's about a girl called Ilse who obviously is a very stubborn person from a rich background who gets sent to boarding school where she learns to keep her mouth shut and wear skirts. By the end of the book, she returns home transformed into a proper young lady, just in time to ensnare her future husband with her newfound feminine delights. So far, so cliché. I don't think I need to discuss the questionable moral message of books like that. But I do want to mention how little this bothers me. Even as a child, I realized that being good at school and being good at housework are far from the most important qualities of a young woman. By the end of these types of stories, the girls inevitably have their individuality completely crushed as they learn to conform. This really does sound a lot more negative than I mean it, because like I said, I always loved these types of stories. It's almost like a guilty pleasure. A classic children's boarding school novel that really stands out in subverting this trope is A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is a British-American children's classic from 1905. The main character Sarah is an individualist and a free thinker, but she does stick to the rules outwardly while keeping her rebel nature on the inside. She also doesn't change much throughout the course of the story, and her strength of character is what gets her through difficult times at the school. The school itself in A Little Princess is not the wholesome and inspirational establishment of the previous two novels that I've described. Instead, it's run by a greedy woman of questionable morals who is in direct opposition to our main character. However, the boarding school in A Little Princess is a place of social and economic wealth and privilege, and that is something it shares with almost all of the institutions in the novels that I'm presenting today. How that privilege is treated by the story varies from book to book. In some books, it's just taken as granted that all of the students are very wealthy, whereas in others, like in A Little Princess, privilege is a major theme of the story itself. Another classic novel with that theme is Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Unlike the previous novels, this one is written not for children but for adults. Published in 1855, this is a novel in which Charlotte Bronte fictionalized her own experiences of working as a teacher in Europe. Unlike any of the other novels in this video, this book is written from the perspective of the teacher and not the student. Lucy Snow is a young British woman who's well educated but poor and moves to continental Europe to take a job as a teacher at a boarding school. And the difference in wealth and social standing between her and the students that she teaches is one of the main themes of the novel. Since I've already mentioned Charlotte Bronte, we've got to talk about Jane Eyre, of course. Jane spends much of the first part of the novel at boarding school, but it's a very different type of boarding school. Lowood is a charity school where the education of poor and orphaned girls is funded by donations. But the school is poorly funded and poorly run, so the students suffer from hunger, cold, and disease. Schools like that really existed in the Victorian age, and I can imagine the description in Jane Eyre being quite an accurate one. A modern and satirical twist on that type of school is described in one of the Lemony Snicket novels. This is the Austere Academy, published in the year 2000. This is a parody of those Victorian charity schools, really, and it depicts a very creepy and hostile place that our three protagonists, who are also orphans, have to almost fight against and fight to get out of. Mostly, though, the schools and boarding school novels are these magical places where children get to be in their own community, in their own society, away from the control of parents, where children have agency and power and space to develop their own sense of self and their relationships with other children. And the most magical of boarding schools is, of course, Hogwarts. Yes, I am going to talk about Harry Potter in this video, but only very briefly. Hogwarts is really heavily inspired by those classic boarding school novels that I mentioned earlier. The school train, the houses, the intramural sport, it's all taken directly from Enid Blyton type stories, which of course are based on real life boarding schools in the early 20th century. The element of privilege of wealth has been replaced with the privilege of magic, and that makes for a really wonderful background for Harry's adventures. I bet there isn't a single child who read Harry Potter and didn't want to be at Hogwarts. As adults, we recognise how messed up and dangerous of a place it really is, with evil lurking around every corner, and we probably wouldn't want our own children to go there. But that's not the point of Hogwarts. It's an amazing magical playground, and the danger is just part of the charm of the books. Finally, I'm going to briefly talk about two modern interpretations of the boarding school genre. The first one is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro from 2005. This novel takes all of the tropes and conventions of the traditional boarding school novel and subverts them in a really beautiful and very chilling way. The story is set in an alternative 1990s Britain, so there's much we recognise from the school in question, and the author really plays with those familiarities. If you're at all interested in boarding school novels written for adults, go check out Never Let Me Go. It is really an amazingly beautiful book. The second modern interpretation I want to mention barely really counts as a boarding school novel, and that is The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. This is a dystopian/horror novel from 2014, and only the first quarter of the book is really set in this school location, which really is an army base in a near-future dystopian Britain. Some very special children are educated on this army base, and the story is mostly told from the perspective of one of those children. I don't want to give you any spoilers if you've not read this book, but if you're looking for an adult twist on the boarding school novel set within the context of an action-packed dystopia, definitely give this one a go. And finally, I want to recommend a non-fiction account of boarding school life, and that is Stephen Fry's first autobiography titled Moab is My Washpot. It describes his experience at boarding schools and really shows that it's not as magical as J.K. Rowling and Enid Blyton will make you think. It's a really well-written and humorous memoir, and if you're at all familiar with Stephen Fry, go ahead and read it, or even better, listen to the audiobook read by him. So these were my thoughts on boarding school novels and some recommendations. Please give me your recommendations in the comments. I'm so keen to read more great boarding school novels. So let me know, what are your favourites? What are some interesting twists on the boarding school tropes that you've come across? What are some traditional boarding school novels you loved as a child? I want to know all of these things. Thank you for watching. Bye.